niece Gwen, reading aloud for you from my novel, The Heartbalm Effect, Book 1 in the Medicine Women of Alaska, Chapter 6. And here, Paul said, leading her to the nurse's station, is where the real heart of the clinic beats. Nurse Winters emerged from a patient examining room and dropped a file down onto the counter. "Oh, Dr. Livingston, you say the sweetest things." She looked up and smiled at Rachel. "So, you finished the grand tour?" "Apparently." "Good," Margie said. "That means I get custody of you." "Oh, okay," Rachel said. "Time to set you up in your office." "Oh," Rachel said with surprise. "I get an office?" "Don't get too excited," Dr. Livingston deadpanned. "It's the size of a broom closet." "Still," Rachel began, "an office sounds nice." "Not only that," Margie said, "but you'll get loads of experience here, let me tell you. Everything and anything walks in through this front door, and I do mean anything." "Oh, really?" "Yes, oh yes." Margie turned to Paul. "Dr. Livingston, I need you to sign off on this script." Paul pulled a pen from his front pocket and put it to the blue paper. "Is this for Mrs. McIntyre?" "Yes, it is." Maggie turned to Rachel. "Hey, you want me to show you around?" Rachel stammered, looking to Paul for confirmation. "I already showed Dr. Lavange around," Paul answered, handing the script back to Margie. "Oh, yeah, right," Margie wisecracked. "Sure you did, Dr. Livingston." "Hey," Paul said, continuing in the same light, bantering mood, "I resemble that." Margie looked at Rachel. "Dr. Lavange, I hate to tell you this, but you got the doctor's tour. I'm going to give you the real tour." "Oh," Rachel said, and then she laughed. Paul glanced sharply at her, but then his features relaxed. "Jeezle Pete's, what in the world's the matter with the guy?" Margie grabbed Rachel by the arm and immediately began introducing her to the other nurses. Rachel watched out of the corner of her eye as Paul scooted away and out of sight. For a first impression, they hadn't gotten on very well at all. And yet, back when she'd interviewed with him 6 months earlier, she'd remembered him as a pleasant, if somewhat laconic man. But now, as she found herself in his company, she couldn't get over how much he entranced her. She recalled the electric charge surging through her body when she grabbed his arm and squeezed his bicep. She'd wondered what this gorgeous man was doing in this one-horse town running this dilapidated clinic. True, he'd spent money where it mattered, in the patient examination rooms, but the flaking and peeling paint in the main reception did not inspire confidence. It looked distasteful when she took her first look around. What in the world did the patients think? Well, she was a mighty resourceful person, wasn't she? How hard would it be to buy a can of paint, a scraper, a can of primer, and get to work on the flaking paint in the main entranceway? He might not like to wield a paintbrush, but she sure did. Rachel followed and paid close attention as Nurse Margie. "Don't call me Nurse Winters, we're not that formal around here, just call me Nurse Margie," cheerfully showed her where everything was stored and how to order new supplies, how to gain access to the locked refrigerator storing the pharmaceuticals, handed her a key, talk about trust, and then introduced her to the nurses. After Nurse Margie finished the introductions, she and Rachel returned to the oncology ward and paused a moment to chat with Mrs. Reynolds, the woman who'd been sitting in the recliner next to the little boy. Margie had said the little boy's name was Ricky Rutherford, and he was taking his last chemotherapy treatment. What a wonderful puzzle you're working on, Ricky, Rachel commented as Ricky manipulated the wood pieces. I like to play this puzzle, Ricky answered, his brow furrowed in concentration. Rachel picked up a puzzle piece and examined it. When Dr. Livingston walked me through here the first time, I thought this puzzle was handmade. It is, Margie said. Dr. Livingston made it himself. Dr. Livingston made it himself, Ricky echoed under his breath. Wow, Rachel noted, unable to conceal her surprise. Why, Dr. Livingston is a man of many talents. You don't know the half of it. He loves to work with wood. But he doesn't like to use a paintbrush? Rachel asked with a keen smile. When I asked him if he minded if I painted the examination rooms, he said I should go for it, but not to expect him to handle a paintbrush. No, he'd much rather saw, stain, and sand wood than paint it. I see, Rachel said. He likes to work with salvaged wood he finds on his hikes in the forest. If you ask me, his greatest talent has been keeping this clinic afloat, Margie said grimly. Rachel had already gotten an inkling of the clinic's problems on her tour with Dr. Livingston. Margie's words intrigued her. Really? What's wrong with the clinic? Oh, Margie, Mrs. Reynolds began, you shouldn't ought to scare off the new doctor before she's even gotten her feet wet. What are you two talking about? Rachel asked. Shall I tell her? Mrs. Reynolds said. Be my guest, Margie said. Mrs. Reynolds turned to Rachel. Dr. Livingston got this clinic started 5 years ago with a grant from the federal government to help the Tlingit tribe, a Native American tribe indigenous to this area. Rachel nodded. She already knew this. She'd learned it at the interview 6 months ago, but she sensed something else. And the state of Alaska kicked in some money, and more money came from a couple of private donors. Margie waved her hand around with a distracted gesture, which is when we built the oncology wing and added offices for the fleet of doctors Dr. Livingston hoped would start flocking to this clinic. At this, everyone turned and looked at Rachel, as if she were the sole representative of all the clinic aspired and hoped to be. Her heart lay elsewhere, but she tried to rise to the challenge of looking like a savior physician to this scrappy little clinic. She stood up tall, stuck out her chin, and attempted to look heroic. If we can get 10 more of this one, Margie said, we'll be in terrific shape. Rachel's heart swelled with the praise, unjustified though it may be. If they only knew what her private hopes were, they wouldn't be smiling at her with such pride. Can we clone you, Dr. Lavanche? Mrs. Reynolds joked. Did your parents produce more of you wonderful women? I do have a younger sister, Rachel said. Get her over here, Margie said. Stat! She's still in medical school. Got a couple more years to go. By the time she's out of medical school, Mrs. Reynolds said, we'll be ready for more doctors. Sounds good to me. Faux heartiness dripping from her words. And yet, deep in her heart, she wondered if the clinic would even be around this time next year. She noticed they were still gazing at her. The oncology ward was built just last year? She asked. Yes, Mrs. Reynolds said with a bemused smile. Just in time for my cancer diagnosis. Oh, that's so sad. No, not really. If it weren't for this place and Dr. Livingston, I wouldn't be able to get any chemotherapy at all. Why not? I'd have to travel over 100 miles every week to the hospital in Fairbanks for chemotherapy. There's no place closer, and depending on the weather, if we get hit with a snowstorm, springtime flooding, or what have you, some of the roads become impassable. I'd have to take a puddle jumper, and I hate flying. They did talk to us in medical school about how hard it can be for some people in this state to get adequate medical care, Rachel said. But I had no idea it was this bad. It's pretty bad, Margie conceded. Dr. Livingston's doing everything he can to drum up money from other sources. I gotta tell you though, if our funding falls through at the end of this year, we'll be forced to shut our doors. It won't matter much to me, Mrs. Reynolds said. I'll probably be dead by then. An awful silence ensued. What a cheerful soul you are, Corinne, Margie remarked. Cheerful soul you are, Corinne, the little boy repeated, and the women laughed.